Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. And today's founder is Robert Troup, Alexander Hamilton's college roommate. Real quick, his name might be pronounced Troup, but I've only read it, never heard it pronounced. So that's how Troup is spelled, and that's how we're going with it. Now, Robert Troup was a young man attending King's College when he had to take on a roommate, like many college kids. And it just so happens his roommate was one Alexander Hamilton. Now, Troup and Hamilton became fast friends, and they end up starting a militia unit together, mostly made up of students at King's College, which we now know today as Columbia University. This group called itself the Corsicans, and they would drill militia drills in the yard of the school. The Corsicans soon changed their name to the Hearts of Oak or Hearts Oak. Sometimes depends on where you read it and who wrote it down. Seems like they couldn't really agree on a name. What they could agree on is they had to resist temptation from the British. And if you're familiar with the Broadway musical Hamilton, you might know that at one point Hamilton says, "Let's go steal their cannons," and they do. Well, that was the Hearts of Oak, and Robert Troup was one of those men with Hamilton stealing those cannons. Shortly after this event, Hamilton goes over and does artillery on Manhattan, or stays on the island of Manhattan. Robert Troup is then brought into another group that goes into the Bronx. Unfortunately for Troup, he's actually captured during this time and spends several months in captivity, in fact, including time on one of the vile prison ships the British had. Fortunately, he was from a wealthy family, fortunately for him, and he was exchanged in a prisoner exchange, and his abilities were noticed. In fact, he becomes a secretary and then aide-de-camp to none other than Horatio Gates, one of the higher-ranking generals in the Continental Army. He's with Horatio Gates through the Battle of Saratoga, where Gates becomes famously one of the celebrated hero of that battle, despite Benedict Arnold doing the real heavy lifting. Troup then joins Gates when Gates goes and becomes a member of the Board of War. The Board of War was kind of created to oversee oversee George Washington. And during this time, the Board of War is involved with the Conway Cabal. Robert Troup becomes secretary of the Board of War because he follows his superior, Horatio Gates, over there. And therefore, he is very loosely affiliated with the Conway Cabal. Now, I do want to note, I've never seen any indication that Troup was speaking poorly of Washington himself. He was always in heavy correspondence with Alexander Hamilton, and therefore they must have agreed on a lot. Probably he also really approved of George Washington, but it's interesting he was associated this while his buddy is becoming a secretary to and an aide to George Washington. So these friends find themselves on opposite sides of the power struggle for leadership of the Continental Army. Now, as for Troup, he serves through the rest of the war, and now I'm calling him Troup. As for Troup, he serves through the rest of the war. Afterward, he ends up finishing his legal studies and actually goes to Albany to study law, where he helps Alexander Hamilton pass the bar. That's right, this man not only was a roommate of Hamilton's, he was about a year older, so he got a little ahead. He helped Alexander Hamilton study and become a lawyer, and then that lawyer would later write the law of the land, aka the Constitution. They remain fast friends. Kind of famously, Alexander Hamilton becomes a member of the New York Manumission Society, which attempted to and eventually did begin the gradual emancipation of enslaved persons in New York State. What's often overlooked is Robert Troup presided over the first meeting of that organization and was arguably a much more important member and activist for equality in New York State. On the back of that, he is elected as an assemblyman for the state of New York, and eventually is actually appointed as a federal clerk. After the Constitution is ratified, there are, of course, federal districts and federal judges in each district to enforce federal laws, or not enforce, that's the executive's job, but determine federal laws, if they've been broken or not. And Robert Troup was a federal clerk for the District of New York for 9 years before he's actually promoted by George Washington himself to become the federal judge for the District of New York. He doesn't necessarily find the heights his friend Alexander Hamilton does in national government, but he certainly reaches a pretty important height at the state level in national government, if you get me right. So that's the story of Robert Troup, not just Alexander Hamilton's roommate, but a really important character in the mix at a lot of fun turning points of the Revolutionary War. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, do me a favor and hit like. That way more people learn about the channel and therefore the American Revolution with us. If you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos about the American Revolution 7 days a week. For example, I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.